in May 2017 when I was watching the statues of several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans. So I was watching statues of Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, PGT Beauregard, all leaders in the Confederacy be taken down. And I was wondering what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Highway. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That to this day, my parents live on a street named after somebody who owned 150 enslaved people. Because the thing about monuments and memorials and iconography is that, and symbols, is that they're not just symbols. They are reflective of the stories that societies tell, and those stories embed themselves into the narratives communities carry, and those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. Which isn't to say that taking down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee is going to erase the racial wealth gap, but it is to say that it is one part of a larger ecosystem of stories and ideas that shape how we understand what has happened to certain communities and what needs to be accounted for and what needs to be amended to repair the harm that has been done to different communities across generations. And so I started getting obsessed with how slavery was remembered or misremembered in New Orleans, and then sort of expanded it out to think about how it was remembered or misremembered across the country, and ultimately wanted to go to different places that represented the sort of patchwork of memory and the patchwork of experiences that are reflective of the inconsistent way that this country memorializes slavery.
I have become, I mean, we're sort of in a period, it seems to me, of like a corrective period about that history just seemingly being more present. And maybe we can talk about maybe why that is. We're going through this period. And certainly I feel like in my education, like it just seems like I learned nothing. I wasn't necessarily a bad student. I wasn't necessarily a good student, but it just seemed to be available at the time. But I wonder, like, on that primary question, like, as you grew up in that context, in the shadow of all these homages to enslavers, like, what was was there consciousness of that? I mean, you individually or just like with your friends? I mean, did it occur to anybody to say like, hey, wait a second, what? That's really messed up. Like, I'm just trying to think, like, if I walked down the street and it was like, I'm just going down Goebbels Avenue, and one day it occurs to me, like, wait a second, there's I have some history with that guy a little bit. I mean, but was there a level of consciousness about that, or?
I think part of the insidiousness of the success of the Lost Cause project and the success of history of white supremacy attempting to distort and manipulate history more generally is that I didn't really have any consciousness of what those statues were or what they represented. I think all the time about how the statue of PGT Beauregard sits in front of City Park, where I would go and like feed the ducks and the geese with my mom on the weekends, and that I was literally feeding the ducks under the statue of a man who ordered the first attack that opened the Civil War. But I had no conception of who that person was. He was he felt like he was just part of what ornamented the entire city, which are these statues of white men on pedestals. And so it wasn't until my adulthood that I feel like I gained a more acute understanding of who these people were and what they stood for. And part of the thing is that part of what white supremacy attempts to do is take empirical statements and turn them into ideological ones, right? So if I say the Confederacy was a treasonous territory that seceded from the Union and raised an army predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery, in a lot of circles, that would be perceived as an ideological statement. And if I'm in a classroom, that would be perceived as me attempting to indoctrinate students with my political beliefs, when it's actually just reflective of the empirical and historical evidence that we have, right? Like the Confederacy said it for themselves. If you look at the Declarations of Confederate Secession in 1861, they say it. A state like Mississippi says, quote, "Our position is thoroughly aligned with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interests of the world." All right, so they were not vague about why they were seceding from the Union. They were quite clear about it. But part of what has happened over the course of more than a century now is that those stories and that sort of evidence, that sort of primary source evidence is not presented to students. And so the narrative of the Confederacy being this thing that was just fighting for states' rights, or Robert E. Lee being an honorable man who was just doing right by his community, or that this war was a war of northern aggression rather than one that was predicated on these folks leaving the country in order to sustain this abominable social and economic practice, it gets muddled, right? It becomes a sort of Orwellian thing where it's not even meant to turn everybody into racist. It's just meant to make people confused, to the point where in 2018, you have a study from the Southern Poverty Law Center that shows that only 8% of U.S. high school seniors are able to identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War, because our teaching around it has been so, people are either scared to address it at all, right, for fear that something will happen. And I think we see in state legislatures across the country an intentional effort to amplify and magnify that chilling effect, to make teachers scared to even touch this stuff, so that you continue to have young people growing up with a skewed sense of what the Confederacy was, what slavery was, and thus how it has shaped the social, economic, and political landscape of our country today.
Well, part of this too, I would say, is like it goes deeper than just, I think, the Civil War as well, right? I mean, there's this concept of Thomas Jefferson. You write about with Monticello, about how there's a quote from someone who took the tour that says this really took the shine off of our guy, because it's about this greater American mythology that upholds then secondarily the conversation that we're talking about, the Civil War, right? I mean, can you just talk about the deeper roots of how we fetishize, mythologize, whatever you want to say, our founding fathers? It is rooted in American exceptionalism and white supremacy, and then of course it's at its starkest in the way that we learn about the Civil War.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first chapter of the book is about Monticello. And I wanted to go to Monticello specifically because Jefferson is such a fascinating historical character to me, in the sense that I think he personifies so many of the complexities and contradictions and the sort of cognitive dissonance of this country's history, which is to say that America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations to achieve wealth accumulation and upward mobility in ways that their ancestors could have never imagined. And it has done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who've been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed to create that wealth and opportunity for the other group. And so both of those things are the story of America. And you have to hold the sort of duality of both of those things in order to understand the duality of this country. And Jefferson similarly, I think, again, embodies that, where he is someone who wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and also enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children that he had by an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings. He wrote in one document that all men are created equal, and wrote in another document that Black people are inferior to whites, quote, in both endowments of body and mind. And so when I go to a place like Monticello, part of what I'm trying to understand is, how does an institution that is in many ways dedicated to preserving the memory and legacy of this person preserve an honest legacy of all of who he was? And not only in preserving that space, Monticello, recognizing that Monticello didn't just belong to Jefferson, but also the hundreds of enslaved people who lived there across generations, who in many ways that land belongs to even more so than it does to Jefferson, because Jefferson was in Paris, in DC, in Philadelphia, in New York for significant stretches of time. And it was these enslaved families, the Hemingses, the Fawcett's, the Grangers, who cultivated that land, who built memories on that land, who created community on that land. And so in order to understand, again, to your point, like why our country looks the way that it does today, we have to understand the nature of how the people who created the social contract upon which this country was founded, who they wanted to include in as the beneficiaries of that social contract, and who they imagined being the people who were going to be exploited to make those benefits possible for others.
And speaking of that exploitation, what is also, I think, sort of fascinating about that is that, you know, he as a farmer would have no time to do that. We're not for I never hear it anymore, but as a kid I remember, you know, there was like this, like behind every great man is a great woman or a strong woman or something like that. And But
I reject that cheesy statement.
I would too. But the interesting thing is like, behind every guy who had the time to draft a constitution is 500 slaves essentially who were financing this guy's being able to have all this time to think. And that was really striking, like that concept, and that is not in any way communicated, I think. Well, I mean, so let's also talk about that, the concept of you, like, you could have just written about these places without sort of assessing how people who are learning these things for the first time or we're absorbing them. I mean, talk about that dynamic where you're interviewing people as as the shine comes off of Jefferson a little bit.
Yeah. So two of the people that I interviewed were women named Donna and Grace. And so Monticello is interesting because I think it represents a place that evolves in the way that has evolved in the way that it is told the story of that place and of Jefferson. So, you talk to people who went there 30, 20, 10 years ago. Their experience at Monticello is very different from what I experienced when I went there in 2018, where now they have a tour dedicated to the Hemings family. They have a tour specifically about the history of slavery at Monticello. But some critique of it is that all of these tours are separate tours, right? And that there's the primary house tour, in which somebody, I went on the house tour and I went on the slavery at Monticello tour. And on the house tour, there wasn't really a lot of discussion about Jefferson as an enslaver. It might have been mentioned, but to your point that I think is really important is that, like, nothing, Jefferson was a very smart person and had a range of interests, philosophical, scientific, geographic. I mean, his mind was sort of everywhere, but he only had the time to pursue those interests, to write these letters, to explore these ideas because of the labor of hundreds of enslaved people who did that. And so I was on the slavery at Monticello tour, and Donna and Grace were clearly being unsettled by so much of what they were hearing from our guide, a guy named David Thorson. And David, as I mentioned in the book, in the span of 45 minutes to an hour, was more direct and honest about Jefferson and his relationship to slavery in ways that I was like, why didn't I learn this in 8th grade social studies class? Like, this should have been central to my understanding of this. But they were, but I was familiar with the information, and these women, from what I could tell on their faces, clearly weren't. So I went up to them after and was talking to them, and they were just like, I had no idea that Jefferson was a slave owner. I had no idea that Monticello was a plantation. And mind you, these are folks who, like, bought plane tickets, rented a car, got a hotel room, and, like, came to this place as a sort of pilgrimage to honor and to see the home of one of our founding fathers and the third president of the United States, and who had no idea that he enslaved human beings. And I think that is a sort of microcosm of the failure of how slavery is taught across this country, in which you could have people who came to this place to pay tribute to this man, and who had no idea what this place actually was, and what this man did to people on this land. And I think it was an important reminder for me, because I think in the worlds that I move in, everybody's like, oh, Jefferson was an enslaver. Like, he's a hypocrite. He was full of moral contradictions. Like, that is how we understand who Jefferson was. But there are a lot of people who just don't know a lot of information, and not just about Jefferson, but about slavery writ large. And that is, again, is it intentional? It is intentional. It is the result of a mid-19th century effort after the Civil War to prevent us from having a collective understanding of what slavery was. And most people don't realize that it wasn't until the mid-20th century, during the Civil Rights Movement, that the narrative around slavery began to shift. Like, it wasn't until the work of historians like Kenneth Stamp and others, and that his work gained mainstream popularity because of the work of activists and civil rights leaders, that the understanding of slavery began to shift toward, like, oh, this was a horrific, cruel, abominable institution. Because until the mid-20th century, the popular narrative around it collectively in this country was that it was a civilizing institution. Ulrich B. Phillips, the predominant historian who propagated this idea, talked about plantations as these places that civilized Africans from the savage year of Africa. As the late Senator John Calhoun from South Carolina, he would always talk about slavery as a positive good for both Black and white alike. And that narrative was central to America's collective understanding of slavery for a century before it began to shift. And we're still attempting to sort of unwind so much of that.
That dynamic I just find fascinating. And I guess, I mean, it's sort of obvious on some level, like why it was, why so many participated in that sort of, I guess, mystification of our history, because it served their power interests, right? I mean, and it sort of kicked off, during Reconstruction with a lot of like literal massacres to make sure that that they were in charge of those things.